Hey everyone, welcome to Operations, the show where we look under the hood of companies in hypergrowth. My name is Sean Lane. When your sales organization is in true startup mode, chances are your sellers are doing just about everything. They prospect, they demo, they negotiate, they close. Hell, they might even be doing some support. Whatever it takes, all hands on deck, right? Then, as your hypergrowth company scales up, you can start to specialize different aspects of your sales motion and bring in specialists to complement your sellers and ultimately accelerate your deals. One of those specialist teams your company might decide to invest in is a solutions consulting team. Whether you call them solutions consultants, sales engineers, or some other combination of the two, their role is meant to not only demo and explain the technical aspects of your company's product, but also to serve as a trusted advisor for the customer throughout the sale. Now, I know all of this because I learned it from today's guest, Josh Perk. Josh is the Senior Director of Solutions Consulting at Drift. During his 3+ years at the company, Josh has scaled the SC team from 2 people to 20 and created a culture where every rep wants someone like Josh as a valued member of their opportunity team. In our conversation, Josh and I talk about where SCs come from, how to measure the effectiveness of a growing SC team, and what he means when he says he hires on a spectrum from big S to big E for his team. If you're thinking about starting an SC team at your company, or you already have one and you aren't quite sure how to articulate its value, this episode will offer you the blueprint that you need. But first, I asked Josh to take me back to when he first arrived at Drift in 2018 and what the catalyst was for why he needed to build out the SC function in the first place.
So it feels a long time ago, although it was only 3 years ago, but you nailed it. So when I first came over to Drift, the idea of a sales engineering team, which is what we called ourselves then, we're solutions consultants now, but one and the same, it existed. So I was blessed enough that I didn't have to convince people to build the function, but it existed in the sense of one other guy. And so for me, I was the first SC that came over that had actually been a sales engineer before. The other guy that was already here was a true engineer. And so the way that we thought about the SC team was different, but it was really helpful of having someone really technically smart and me a little bit more on like the managerial side. The thing that was really sort of that waking moment of like, we have to do this, we need to invest way more into this, is when Drift started to make this shift from, hey, we're not going to just be transactional anymore, where people are going to show up with their credit card and buy some software. We're really going to move to a platform. And so what was most important was not the fact that like, okay, we're suddenly calling ourselves a platform, bring on the SEs. What was really important was the fact that we changed our selling motion. We said, we're going to actually not just go in and sell chatbots or sell a piece of SaaS. We're going to actually understand digital transformation and the way that data flows between marketing automation systems and CRMs. And all of a sudden it became a much bigger, loftier sell. And that's where you kind of have to, bless your salespeople's hearts, but you can't expect them to be able to handle the commercials while also being able to go super deep into that technical stuff.
And so when you talk about going deeper into the technical sale, right, like that to me would be probably the most obvious thing if I were looking at an organization and trying to figure out whether or not I needed to have a solutions consulting team. Like, okay, technical product, I need somebody technical on the call. What are some of the other triggers for people who maybe are at that inflection point in their company of reasons why a team like that might need to be created or need to get bigger?
Yeah, so I actually don't think that a technical product is the motivation for having an SC team anymore.
Okay.
It used to be it. For like 20 years, that was why you needed an SC, right? You said, wow, this is kind of complex. There's like some smart things we need to talk about. Let's go hire some smart people. And that's why the original SC function was like truly engineers, right? Just like people that we took from the engineering team and said, like, can you help salespeople explain this a little bit better? And the reason I think that's not the motivation for SE or SE teams anymore is because of the way that the buying culture is shifting. And what I mean by that, I think the best way to explain it is to look at, what Drift was born out of, right? We said, hey, forms work, but they work because they have to work, right? Like people have to fill out a form. And so it was a necessary evil. That's kind of what I'm starting to see in the way that prospects are buying. They're saying like salespeople work, but they're kind of a necessary evil. Like I just kind of need to go through them to talk to the person that actually knows what they're talking about. Not that salespeople don't know what they're talking about, but this deep level of understanding the product. And so I think SEs don't just fill a technical role anymore. I think they fill a trust role of someone that says like, hey, we're on the sales team, but I actually don't truly care about my sales rep hitting their number. I care about making sure that, I have some self-esteem here that puts you in the right product.
And I also feel like in that shift, there's almost this perception too that creates that trust, which is like your team or people like your team are not necessarily perceived there to only be there to close the deal. They are perceived there to add that value, to explain the how and the why of what you're looking at, as opposed to just like, okay, we're at stage 1 of the sales process now, time to move on to stage 2.
Yes. I've never been a salesperson before, so I can't tell whether this joke is accurate or not, but I always tell people there's only one thing worse than an AE getting clawback, and that's an SE selling the wrong solution. Like just like the embarrassment that comes with a customer saying like, you told me this and it doesn't do that is I'd rather they take some of my paycheck back than have to go have that conversation with the customer.
In case you couldn't tell, Josh takes a lot of pride in the work that his team does and the role that they play in our sales motion here at Drift. And he's right. As the buying culture continues to evolve, the roles of these trusted advisors only become more important. So let's say you're like Josh and you think your company needs to make an investment in a solutions consulting team. How do you do that? When I asked Josh, he told me he couldn't just jump ahead to posting a bunch of job postings. In fact, he told me that I was one of the hurdles he needed to clear first.
Before the people was getting the permission to get the people, which was not easy. And actually, this is why I feel like a relationship with operations was so important. Because, operations historically are the folks that say like, give me data that shows that this is like the right investment. And then if the Boolean equals true, then we'll give it to you. Sean, you remember that? That was like not a thing. Like when it was like one or two of us, like I had no data. There was so much relationship that I had to build with you to just say like, hey, like we think that me being here is helpful. And we had anecdotal data, but we didn't know how that was going to scale. And the reason that I needed your trust so much in sort of building out this team was because even if I had given you data, the way that I was operating as a team of 1, 2, or 3 is not the way that an SE team is going to operate at 20. So the data I would have given you was false, right? Because me coming in as a transactional SE saying, here's how the integration works, great, I'll never talk to you again, is much different than the role I play now as an SE and leading my team of 20, which is way more relationship focused. So it's a horrible answer, but getting trust to get people is really, really important before you have the data to show that it's worth it.
Totally agree with you. And so once you've built that trust and you've got like the, check mark, like, okay, go Josh, go forth and multiply and bring some people back. Like, where do SCs even come from? Right? Like we've had people on this show who talk about how, in ops, some of them, fall into it. Some of them come from a finance background. We've had some people who were in sales and then made the switch to ops, which I think is a rare one. Like, what are the paths to becoming an SC?
That's what's so interesting about this career field is the answer to where or how did you first become an SC is different for everyone that I interview. In part because it's a newer career field, although I did interview someone the other day that said they majored in it, which kind of made me feel like I'm starting to get old. Yep, it's something you can go to school for now.
That's awesome.
It is super cool that it's starting to take off, and we've got some great communities in this space that have really made it more popular. But before people were able to major in it, usually there were 2 different ways that folks came into being SEs. They were either career SEs, which means that they probably started somewhere else in the org, whether they were an engineer or they were a salesperson that realized they're a little bit more technical than their colleagues, and they kind of stumbled into it. And then the other way that we find people are more like industry practitioners. So folks that were users of your software or in the space that you're selling to, and maybe need to learn some more of the sales or technical skills, but really understand the space that you're in. And to be honest, in order to make my team successful, I needed to have both of those. So I go out and purposely hire folks that have no SE experience, but really understand our market. And then I have the opposite, who can lead my team a little bit better and show those newer SEs what it's like to be an SE, because they're more career focused.
That's really interesting. And so I would imagine that in the team makeup, right? Like you've got those pros and strengths, and sometimes those things can balance each other out. But I would also imagine that does that have an impact on the way you actually staff those people to deals? Because I could see it's not everybody entering a deal is created equal at that point.
Right. Yeah, it does. So when we're looking at sort of the talent pool on an SE team, I no longer think about them as industry practitioners versus existing SEs.
Okay.
Instead, I put all of those people on sort of a spectrum of what I would call like big S or big E. And it's a pretty popular analogy in the sales engineering community. But to break it down is, if you're a big S, that means that your first instinct is being a little bit more of a salesperson. You kind of understand the business needs, and you're maybe a little bit of a smooth talker, and you're like socializing. If you're a big E, perhaps you don't have all of those skill sets, but you're really good at understanding the technology and the product, and you can go toe to toe with like a CTO or a CEO on some of those big deals. And that's why it's so important to have both of them, because there's no right or wrong answer. It's going to totally depend on the AE that you're matching them with, and sometimes even the deal that you're in. And so at Drift, we do our best to have AE to SE ratios or relationships that they're all consistent. But we find that there are times where we say like, hey, even though you constantly work with this person, they now need to go talk security and get super deep into GDPR and our APIs with Salesforce. We're going to actually take you off of it and go have, our big E SE handle that part of the deal and then bring you back in to close it.
What I find really interesting here is that Josh is not just blindly assigning resources to deals because solutions consultant A always works with sales rep B. In fact, he's plotting his team members on that spectrum that he mentioned. Big S for sales to big E for engineer, and then assigning them based on fit. This sounded to me like it made a lot of sense from an individual deal perspective, but I also wondered if it complicated things a bit when trying to build a system around SE capacity or AE to SC ratios, or just a simple relationship between an SE and their AE. Is there a target ratio or setup that we should be aiming for when building out one of these teams? Turns out there's some art and some science behind the whole thing.
So there's two parts to like for the operations folks in the room. There's like a mathematical equation that you guys will care more about, and then there's more of like the emotional equation that the people bringing this problem to you will care about. Okay. So the mathematical equation is like, you sell your product for a certain amount of money, and your SE brings a measurable amount of value, and it's usually in three different forms. It's either in speed to a deal. So deal velocity is something that we measure. Did it close faster because of the SE? Did the deal close larger? So ASP that a SE brings. And then there's the binary, did we get a technical win that we would not have gotten without an SE? So those are the three sort of measurements that you can pursue. And then it's just straight math, right? Of how many of those do we need to offset the cost of the team, and can we just continue to kind of pour gasoline on this perfect ratio? So that's the scientific answer. The more emotional answer is there are also bandwidth constraints, and like maybe that formula doesn't balance out perfectly. If you have a low ASP and a really high touch deal, like that ratio is not going to work super well, and you can't do what I did for my first year at Drift, which is have a 1-to-90 ratio of AEs to
Why?
SEs.
That sounds fine.
Super sustainable.
Yeah, very normal.
So somewhere in there, you kind of have to figure out like what's the magic sauce for our team. And so long story short, for us at Drift, and what's pretty popular across most like enterprise SaaS companies is 1-to-1 or 1-to-3-ish in your enterprise markets, depending on your ASP, and then in your mid-market and your growth, or whatever you sort of call your commercial business, you're looking anywhere from 1-to-5 to 1-to-10 if you're in like a super velocity motion.
Got it. And so my second question about kind of like this staffing conversation and the bandwidth thing kind of underlines this is, there's going to be a moment, and I think this is true of ops people too, where you got to say no, right? Or you've got people on your team who have to be self-aware enough to know where they are on that big S to big E spectrum. And they have to say, I'm actually not the right person here, right? How are you managing those conversations both within your own team in terms of coaching the folks in your team, but then also with that crucial partnership you have with sales where they want somebody no matter what, right? But sometimes that bandwidth might not exist. Like, is that something that's coming up for you?
It comes up a ton, and it's not unlike what I imagine the relationship between operations and your sales teams are, in the sense of, you kind of support these folks. It's important that you maintain a healthy relationship with them. You don't want them to dislike you, but at the same time, you have a job to do. And so what we see happen in the SE world is one of two things. So one is your SE is so beloved and so good at closing deals that an AE wants to use them for everything, right? Oh, come join my discovery, do more than just listen, actually run it for me. Or, hey, we're going to kind of avoid all of operations process for closing a deal. And we're just going to have you go show them whatever they want. And there's those sorts of things where I really rely on my SE team, because they're the ones that are in the weeds kind of experiencing that. I like for them to be able to instill that trust of like, hey, we're well-paid professionals. We're both here to get a job done right. I need you to use me in the best way so that, in the future, when your colleague wants to misuse me, I'm available for you, right? It kind of goes full way around. And then there's the opposite side of, you go back to like the challenger sale, kind of old school. There are folks on sales teams that like just don't want to work with other people, right? They don't want to use SEs. They think that they're great at demoing it, and it's really important for an AE to build a relationship with that. An SE to build a relationship with that AE and say like, hey, you are good. Like, I appreciate that. My job is to not replace you. My job is to not put risk in your deal by adding someone else that, isn't in your control. My job is to be an expert at this one thing, which is demonstrating the product and answering solution questions so that you can focus on what you do best, which is the commercials and making sure that this is a good fit on that end of the business.
In addition to starting to build relationships with its internal customers, Josh has also now clarified exactly how the business will measure and find value in his team's work. He told us 3 specific metrics: deal velocity, deal size, and the presence of a technical win. If you're starting a team like Josh's, these are super simple and straightforward measurements that you can be tracking in your opportunity process. We're going to revisit those a little bit more later in the show, don't worry. I also really liked how Josh described the guardrails around the work that his team does. He said that they're there to demo the product and answer solution questions. Meanwhile, they're freeing up the salesperson to do what they do best: sell. Landing on those guardrails, though, isn't always so straightforward. Anytime you introduce a new role, chances are that role is taking some responsibility away from somebody else's, even if the new role is better suited for that work. So I asked Josh, what were those early days like of defining the split in responsibilities, or overlaps in some cases, between the solution consultants and the sales team?
So I've got an unpopular opinion, I think, when it comes to this subject. So I don't necessarily recommend what I'm about to say for most teams. I'll follow it up with what I do recommend for most teams. But I knew really early on when I came into Drift to establish the team that the best way for me to get trust in you as my operations leader and get that investment from my now boss, our CRO, was to kind of be the person that didn't say no. And so I kind of made that personal decision of like, I'm gonna be a little bit tired this year. I'm gonna work a little extra hard and probably do things that I should be saying no to, because I wanted to end that first year and have nobody in the sales work say like, there's nothing Josh can't do. That is not sustainable after you start hiring people. Like, if you want to make that personal choice and sort of build that personal brand, absolutely do it. And I think it's been rewarding for me. I think now I've established a sort of trust and brand where people say like, he can help us. But now that I have a team of 20, I can't let them operate that way, right? It's going to turn into burnout. It's going to turn into blurry lines. And for SEs, once you do something once, you set the expectation that you're happy to do that again. And so I don't recommend that anymore. I have my team set really clear expectations. And when a new AE gets brought onto the team, one of the first things that they do is sit down with their SE and they say, hey, this is how I work. what communication channels do you prefer? Here's how much notice I need for a demo. They sort of set those boundaries and then facilitate the relationship from there.
I do think though, like the core of that, like the core takeaway though, whether it's in ops or as a solutions consultant, is no matter what type of relationship you're trying to build, proving that some sort of value exists up front buys you so much goodwill for later, right? So like to your point about, you know, whether it's response time or the value, the way you're willing to go the extra mile on a particular deal, like, yeah, you can't do that. It's not sustainable. You're going to burn out. But the relationship building you do up front, if you can add value to those first couple interactions and manage the perception that your AE or your team has of you, later on, when you do need to actually have a reasonable amount of time to do something, it's okay, right? Like there's not this moment of like, well, Josh doesn't know what he's doing. That's why this is taking so long. Like that moment doesn't exist. There's already that inherent trust. And I think like it's probably the exact same with SEs as it is in ops, which is, you know, we tell every new person who joins our team, like, I could care less if I have to teach you what filter goes on what report 6 months from now. Not a big deal. We can teach you that. What we can't do is go back and reset the relationship or lack of relationship that you've built with XYZ sales rep, leader, manager, whatever, because once those first few months pass, like that opportunity has been missed.
Yes. Yeah. It's locked in stone. This is a horrible analogy, but it's like when you're first going on a date and you're just trying to figure out who the first person is going to text after the date. I take the position of like, I'm going to text. I'm going to let that AE know that like, I love them to death. I'm going to do everything for them and that we should go on another date soon. But to your point, you're exactly right. Like you make that first step to say like, hey, I'm here for you. I want to see you win as well. But there's going to be some sort of stakes in the relationship that make sure that we work fluidly together. So it's a good give and take. And the unfortunate side of it, and I see this all the time when I'm mentoring other SE leaders, is sometimes it doesn't work out, and then you have SE managers that are having to shift which SE reports to which AE, and they couldn't figure it out themselves, and that turns into a whole nother sticky mess.
If you take nothing else from this episode, I think the salient lessons that Josh wants you to take away are: always text first after a date and tell your AE you love them. But seriously, what any new team at a company must do is prove that team's value. Show they're going to make the lives of those around them and the lives of their customers better. I mentioned earlier that we're going to come back to some of the specific ways that Josh created to measure his team's value. And I wanted to do that because I wanted to dig a little deeper. If you're starting a team like this, or you already have a team in place and you're looking for ways to articulate your value, it's okay to start simple. I know that that's what Josh and his team did because I was there when they did it. So where do you start?
And you know this as my operations person. It's living and breathing. We're still figuring out some of those things as we go. But the honest answer was it started with you guys. It started with a team that was more analytical than me, which says a bunch, being an SC, right? How smart you guys are, basically saying like, hey, you kind of need to get your ducks in a row. And so I was the one that ultimately figured out these are the three things that I think we're going to measure, but it was my partnership with the operations team that inspired, like, we need to go figure something out. So having a strong relationship there, like I said in the beginning, is super important. But we didn't come out of the gates with a super mature model. We started with, I think, where a lot of folks start in operations, which is like, let's just log everything, right? Like, we log everything, we'll eventually find the data. And if I remember correctly, Sean, I think there was a point where like you were pulling things out of like Google Docs for us and building like pivot tables. And we were trying to like retroactively assemble like all this sort of data.
I've blocked this from my brain. I don't remember.
Yeah, those are bad 4-letter words in ops when you start talking about your pivot tables and stuff. But we started by just saying like, hey, everything that we do, we're going to tie it to an opportunity. So if we demo, we're going to put an event in Salesforce. If we prep, we're going to put an event in Salesforce. And it started off not really knowing what we were going to use that data for. We just knew that we needed to populate this big database of information. And as we've gotten more mature, we've realized what's actually important and what's not. So the things that we've matured is figuring out like, okay, let's not just log events, let's actually log the amount of time that those events are taking, which feels kind of natural. We should have been doing that from the beginning. And then you start to look at, if you start getting really sophisticated, you can start to find patterns between the events that you're logging and the outcome of the opportunity. So one of the game changing points for us is when your team added like the historic opportunity information to say, hey, when we log this event, the opportunity was in discovery. And when we log this other event, it was in demo. And once we started building out this chronological timeline of events tied to opportunity stages, we were able to really start getting sophisticated with, okay, for opportunities that we did join in discovery, our close rate went to 47% won. And if we didn't, it was at 37%. So you can get really sophisticated.
Yeah. And I think the only other thing that I would add to that in terms of what you guys were able to do was it wasn't just your generic presence, right? We started to identify that there were certain categories of inputs or certain categories of activities that you all were actually doing on these calls. And those within themselves had slightly different flavors. And I would imagine similar to the big S, big E thing, right? Like there are probably people that were stronger or weaker at some of those different inputs. One of the things that is, I think, a little bit of a cheat for you and I is like, we work at the company and use the product for the thing that we're selling, right?
Yes.
And so it's more obvious, I think, if you're on the sales or marketing side, like, hey, yeah, we use Drift at Drift. But your team has also been able to, I think, leverage the product in a somewhat unique way. Can you talk a little bit about how you're leveraging it? Because it's, it's one thing to just say, eat your own dog food or whatever, but we're using it in ways that aren't necessarily our stated public value adds.
Yes. Yeah. So you're exactly right. There are a couple of things that just kind of make sense when you think of Drift. So when, someone comes to the website and they're a target account and, they're in the solution validation phase of their opportunity, we'll get a notification that says like, hey, go jump in and chat with them. Those are the kinds of the things that you would think that we use Drift for, which we absolutely do. The one that's been game changer for me is Drift Video. And so for those of you that might not be familiar with it, just this ability to record asynchronous content, not unlike this too much, and then be able to share that with a prospect. And I think we've all experienced some sort of video being sent to us. But what's really cool about Drift Video is this ability to be able to actually have a conversation with that person. And so a great example is when I have to sell, have to isn't the right word, when I sell to operations folks, right? And so one, guys are super busy. And two, usually we're talking about very technical things. So it's not just me saying, hey, the Salesforce integration is 3 clicks, you're going to love it. Operations people are like, no, everyone says that. You're going to actually need to show me what you're talking about. And so instead of trying to figure out how can I go sit down for an hour with this really busy person, I can record a 5-minute video and say like, hey, I'm going to pull up a sandbox of Salesforce. I'm going to record it. I'm going to connect it. You said that you use these fields and these objects. Let me show you how I'm doing that so you can validate whether this is the right way to do it. And then at 11 o'clock at night, when you put the kids to bed, you can watch that video and then I'll get a notification and we can make sure that I answered those little questions for you. So it saves my team a bunch of time because we don't have to jump into meetings unwillingly or when we don't have a bunch of time. But more importantly, I think it's a really good experience for the prospect of just, hey, when you get around to it, here's some content.
Yeah. And I think, to bring us full circle back to the beginning of our conversation, right? It aligns really well with this buyer-centric customer journey that you were describing when you were basically saying that like the way people are buying is shifting and you don't have to necessarily have a separate call for every single one of these checklist items that someone wants to ask about. And you don't have to have a live demo for every single feature that you necessarily are purchasing, right? You can tailor both the sales process, but also like what the different mediums of communication look like, I think, which is, I think, what you guys have been able to do.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And going back to your original point is, I think the reason that a solutions consultant or a sales engineer is no longer just important for, selling the technical parts of your product is the trust part. And there's something that is, inherently trustworthy about saying like, hey, I'm respecting your time. I'm also building you something that's super custom to your instance. I'm not just going to send you a help doc of our Salesforce how-to integration guide. And I think that's what we're here for, is to just really help customers make sure that they're validating the right solutions and that it's going to fit in their ecosystem.
Before we go, at the end of each show, we're going to ask each guest the same lightning round of questions. Ready? Here we go. best book you've read in the last 6 months?
Ooh, good one. I have a bunch. I have 4 sitting on my desk right now. I just finished, and it probably is the best one that I've read in the last 6 months. The Making of a Manager by Julie Zhu. Have you heard this one before?
No.
This one's really good. So Julie Zhu was one of the first product managers at Facebook.
Okay.
And she got put into a manager role at a really young age. And so this is sort of like the chronicles of her kind of growing into this role from a young 20-something-year-old to, a mature, mid 30-year-old manager. And one of my favorite things that she documented are the different challenges that a manager will face depending on how you got into the manager role. So for example, me as an individual contributor that advanced my way into a management role has a totally different set of problems, like, now reporting, or my past reports, or my past colleagues now being my reports. Those are sort of problems that I face versus, Nick Masters, who's on my team, who I hired him into a manager role. He has a totally different set of problems where he's got, immediate respect from his team, but they also, he had to learn the product. He had to kind of earn some of that. So she did a great job kind of broadcasting that.
That's a good one. All right, next one. Normally I ask people their favorite part about working in ops, so I'll tweak it for you. Favorite part about working in solution consulting?
Oh, man. For me, it's about the balance. It's the ability to say, like, hey, I get to be excited about the technology and sort of make that part of my brain excited, but also being able to verbalize that and interact with our customers on a daily basis. When you're engineering and you're just kind of putting out code, you don't really get to see it in the wild to see how that's solving problems. But as a solutions consultant, I get to build the solutions, I get to implement them, and then you get to see the actual results that your customers have, which is just really fulfilling.
Flip side, least favorite part about working in solution consulting?
Oh my goodness, probably the same. This is going to get me probably a lot of bad LinkedIn messages. Maybe the worst part about being an operations person too. The relationship that you build with sales is so important and oftentimes very tricky to navigate. And so I think that can be very important to get right. And that's why, going back to some of the things that we talked about earlier, just setting forward really, really early that we're all here for the same reason. And if I ever disagree with you, it's because I have good intent and I want to do it the right way. It can be challenging, but also rewarding if you do it right.
You can come back. We can do a whole another half hour on just that alone.
That's right.
Someone who impacted you getting to the job you have today?
Oof. My dad was a big one. I know I'll have to go back and listen to all of the different episodes. I'm sure everyone probably said that.
No, that's a good one.
Interesting. So I kind of swore that I was going to be nothing like my dad, and I ended up being everything like my dad, which is probably a pretty common theme for a lot of folks. My dad was in the Air Force, and we moved around a bunch. And so I always told myself, like, I'm never going to join the Air Force. Like, I hated that experience of having to move and never having the same friends. And lo and behold, I joined the Air Force and became an intel analyst. And so by being inspired to go into the Air Force and kind of cater to that technology side of my brain is the reason I became an SE. And my dad is kind of my number one cheerleader when it comes to my career and always giving me advice. So I have a lot to thank him for.
That's awesome. All right, last one for you. One piece of advice for people who want to have your job someday.
Oh, interesting. Stay scrappy. As cheesy as that is, it goes back to what we were talking about a second ago, which is, think about sort of your self-respect and what you want to be known for, but also think about, how your end users, in my case, our actual customers, but also our salespeople, the lens that they see you through. I hope that I've got a personal brand of positivity and upbeatness and always trying to bring, innovative ideas. And so just constantly seek something that's broken and try to figure out how you can help your company fix it. And I think you're going to be in a good spot.
Thanks so much to Josh for being this week's guest on operations. And thanks so much to Josh's team for all the work they do to make our sales team better. Really appreciate each and every one of you. If you liked what you heard today, make sure you are subscribed to our show so you get a new episode in your feed every other Friday. And if you feel like you took something away from today, let us know. Leave us a review. Leave us a 6-star review on Apple Podcasts, 6-star reviews only. All right. That's going to do it for me. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you next time.